Welcome back to We the Union. This is episode 9. This is our AAPI Heritage Month episode, and there's so much to learn. I learned a lot during the interview, and I hope that you all will learn a lot as well, and hopefully we can start to build a more inclusive labor movement. So I don't want to waste too much time during the intro, so let's get on to the interview. Okay, as you all know, May is AAPI month, Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So I'm joined today with Emily, who is going to talk about, kind of the history of the AAPI community and the labor movement. So let's start with you introducing yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Emily. I am currently a graduate student in Cinema and Media Studies at UCLA. Prior to that, I worked as a labor union communications staffer for the AFL-CIO, as well as I worked a little bit as an organizer in training for public employee unions like AFSCME. And I am currently working on research regarding the unionization and worker activism in the entertainment, media, and tech industries.
Oh, wow, you have a very long history in the labor movement. That's awesome. It's good to hear. So let's just jump straight into it. Can you talk about some of the major contributions that the AAPI community has had with the labor movement and unions in general?
Sure, and I think, the important thing to remember when we talk about history is that history is really a living story. The way that we understand it now is not necessarily the way that we will always understand it. I like to think of history as a story that we tell about the past to help us understand where we are in the present so that we can shape the type of future that we want to organize and move towards. So I just want to give the condition that I'm not a labor historian. I'm happy to share what I know and what I've learned throughout my time as a member of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, as a person who worked in the labor movement, and as a person who still very much cares about historical and ongoing movements for worker rights. But I also understand that this is a short history. It's going to be a bit incomplete and honestly pretty California centric, just due to where we are. I'm recording out of the LA area, so that's what I'm familiar with. But I am conscious that there are gaps in this, and this history that we know and have today, as far as the work of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the labor movement. It is skewed towards East Asians. There needs to be more work lifting up the work of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in terms of the broader U.S. labor movement. But at the same time, I do want to give the time and commemorate the work that so many activists and historians and other labor activists have worked really hard to lift up and to bring out of the shadows. So with that said, the story of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. context, it is pretty much it's a labor history. A lot of the motivations for why people ended up in the U.S. if they immigrated, or how their relationship to the government and state of the U.S. is their work relationships, their labor relationships. So, if we have to pick a place to start, we can talk about 1849, the year of the California Gold Rush, where you have the wave of immigrants from China who are coming, attracted by the opportunities that are being promoted to them, the idea of the U.S. as Gold Mountain. And then once you have this group of people in the country, I think folks are familiar by now with the project of the Transcontinental Railroad and the major role that Chinese workers played in building that. The Transcontinental Railroad is, considered one of the most significant engineering feats of the 19th century, linking the East Coast and the West Coast of the US. And Chinese workers were, thousands of Chinese workers were part of this project and were often put into the most dangerous, most precarious jobs because they're, they weren't considered, to be as the same status as, white railroad workers. And they actually did strike to improve their conditions. 3,000 Chinese railroad workers struck to in what was, what is the first recorded strike involving Asian American workers. So that's a significant moment for where, the Asian community in the U.S. and labor issues and workers issues are intersecting. And then from there, you have to talk about the anti-immigrant sentiment that comes along in just a couple of years after this, in 1882. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which for the first time in U.S. history bars a group based on their race and national origin. And something that might be new information for folks, but definitely impacts the way that Asian immigrants and folks who are even second generation or several generations, their families have been here. If they come from Asian origin or Asian countries, these racially discriminatory immigration laws lasted from 1882 to the 1960s. So that's over 80 years of restrictive immigration and all of the social and cultural discrimination that comes with those types of U.S. government policies. So I think that's an important piece of, even if it's considered to be part of, Asian immigrant history, that also impacts how communities are formed, what types of jobs communities can take on. So that's a major piece of, I think, Asian American labor history as well. And then something that I think it's also important to recognize, and for us in this current moment to try to understand and work through better. Hawaii has a long and proud labor history. And the way that this gets talked about is often about the union organizing that was led by Asian workers and Hawaiian workers in the sugar plantations in Hawaii. It's often talked about as this moment where multiracial coalitions are coming together to organize for their labor rights. Hawaii has one of the highest rates of union density even to today. So there's obviously a long and proud labor history there. And many of the unions in Hawaii have historically been led by AAPI leaders. But at the same time, I think there's a larger conversation happening now about, well, what does that mean that we have, East Asian or folks who are considered Asian Americans leading as leaders in Hawaii when there's still Native Hawaiians there. So talking about decolonizing and talking about sort of colonialism and then looking at that within our own communities as well, I think is a conversation that's coming up. But it is important to note a lot of the interethnic organizing that was happening in Hawaii at the time and still continues, especially since Hawaii is one of the most densely unionized states in the US today. And then when we get into the early 1900s, another example of interracial labor organizing cross ethnic communities is the Oxnard sugar beet strike in 1903. This was launched by the Japanese Mexican Labor Association. So they struck, they won wage increases, But when they applied for a charter with the American Federation of Labor, they were denied unless they agreed to exclude Japanese workers from the unions. So this is another important part of labor history that I think the broad labor movement, is compelled to address, is this history of anti-Asian exclusion, not just as a policy of the US government, but as a policy of the mainstream US labor movement itself. Samuel Gompers, who is the first president of the AFL, was a lifelong opponent of Asian immigration and refused to allow Asians to join unions. So anti-Asian sentiment is also baked into the way that the labor movement built up itself. So I think that's another important kind of historical legacy that is worth thinking about. How does that impact the labor movement today? In 1924, the second large wave of immigrants from Asia came from Japan. They're considered the Issei, or first generation Japanese Americans, who worked in agriculture as low wage workers, so doing farm work. And again, in 1924, a new immigration act barred more Japanese from immigrating like the Chinese before. So we're seeing a pattern of, bringing workers in to do these hard labor, low status, low pay work, and then cutting them off, from building real communities inside of the U.S. by enacting discriminatory immigration laws. So that's another theme that we'll see in terms of this AAPI labor history. And then in 1935, you have another wave of immigrants coming into the U.S. Due to U.S. colonization of the Philippines. So this is after the Spanish-U.S. War. This is interesting because it's a colonial relationship. And so Asian exclusion laws did not apply to Filipinos because they were considered American nationals, kind of like the situation with Puerto Rico today. So there was, exchange back and forth, but at the same time, because the U.S. government and largely white patriarchal power structures that were determining these laws and these relationships, they didn't see Filipinos as Americans, as like equal to people who could come in and freely travel and and build real lives, be really a part of the American dream. So in 1935, the Tidings-McDuffie Act passed, which granted the Philippines quote unquote independence, but in effect excluded more Filipino immigration to the U.S. because they were now considered, they were no longer American nationals, and they were Asian again under U.S. law. So blocking their immigration. And then this is a pattern, I think, with talking about colonization in the Philippines. And then you have the U.S. wars in Asia from the World War II, from 1942, when President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. You have the war in Korea, the U.S. war in Korea, which ends in 1953, and we see a new wave of immigrants and refugees coming into the U.S. From Korea as a result of that conflict. And then, this pattern of U.S. involvement, conflict, war, interference in Asia is really driving a lot of this movement of Asian immigrants into the U.S., into work situations that are difficult, difficult jobs, service sector jobs, low-paying jobs. And so that's all part of the history of Asian American Pacific Islander work in the US. Kind of skipping ahead into the 1960s, we have the 1965 Immigration Act, which repeals a lot of these racist immigration policies that excluded large-scale migration from Asia over the generations. And this is really a direct result of the civil rights movement, led by Black Americans who were met with widespread violence and mass arrests at the hands of law enforcement. And really, Asian Americans are a huge beneficiary of the civil rights movement because the challenges against Jim Crow and legally sanctioned discrimination helped to dismantle a lot of these exclusionary and racist immigration policies. So there is, this is not the first time where the activism of Black Americans is directly related to the expansion of opportunities and civil rights for Asian American Pacific Islanders. So the exponential growth of the Asian American Pacific Islander community from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia is a direct consequence of the change in immigration law in 1965. And so this is definitely a watershed year where we see more immigration happening. And 1965 is also the year that Filipino farm workers launched the Lano grape strike in California. They were the first to go out on strike against the farm industry and corporations that, farm work is hard labor, just like a lot of the work that Asian immigrants were doing up until this time. And I think they were out on strike for a week, and then the leaders of the grape strike, Philip Vera Cruz, Larry Itliong, Pete Velasco, Cesar Chavez approached them, and the United Farm Workers of America is a result of the merging of two union organizations, of two labor organizations, one that was mainly Filipino workers and then one that was mainly Mexican American workers. So again, we're seeing this inter-ethnic solidarity and organizing that is key to the story of Asian American Pacific Islander labor in the US. And then I think, it's also important to note that Asia is a big country. Let me say that again. Asia is a big continent.
Yes.
Asia is a big continent. And we've seen already that the US has varied relationships with the different countries in Asia, ranging from, economic, political, colonial, imperial, different wars. And so those all will shape what the relationship or what the conditions of those different Asian and Pacific Islanders communities are when they get to the US, when they immigrate or when they, are forced into the country due to, deteriorating conditions in their homelands. So just wanted to mark that in the 70s, we see a large wave of immigrants and refugees from Southeast Asia due to a lot of the US wars over in Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries, and how that creates a political situation that, the US by beginning and by participating in this conflict and fighting the wars over in Southeast Asia, drives another wave of immigrants and refugees into this country, into the US. And this is when you start to see immigrant and refugee communities popping up in places you don't expect, because it wasn't like the US government was like, oh, it would make sense to send people here, or there. It was just like, we'll bring them over to, to Oklahoma, to wherever in Louisiana, to, the middle of the country where there's no existing community or infrastructure. And so that begins to shape the labor and community conditions for a lot of these folks who now have to try to set roots and find jobs in these communities that are not necessarily prepared to, to take in a large refugee population. And then I think just coming ahead to the 1990s, I do want to note that on May 1st, 1992, we see the founding convention of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. So 500 Asian American Pacific Islander workers gathered in Washington, D.C. to found the first constituency group of the AFL-CIO that is focused on recognizing and lifting up the voices of AAPI workers. And again, the ability of APALA to form is due to the fact that Black and Latinx workers had formed their own constituency groups, organized to have their communities recognized by the AFL-CIO. And so we were really building off of their organizing and their victories, and have a lot to not just to learn from, but to really respect that it was the fact that they broke that ground that we were able to get APALA formed back then. And then I think looking at where we've come from there, there's definitely a lot of I want to say it's been almost 30 years since APALA formed. So we were formed in 1992. It's 2021 now. So in 2022, that will be the 30th anniversary. And so much has happened even in that short 3 decades. I think I started out near the 1850s with this timeline. And there's just so much that gets kind of left out or talked over or not gone into depth when you're trying to do a history that's that long. Right. So for everything that's happened since 1992 when the APALA formed, I think I just want to say that I can get more into that when I talk about APALA, but we're coming out with a book of interviews with APALA leaders who were there from the beginning, who are our new generation of young leaders, and there's just so many stories that are worth getting into and following there, because as of 2021, as of today, Asian American Pacific Islanders are the fastest growing ethnic group in the U.S. When you look at it proportionally, there are 18 million AAPIs in the U.S. 70% are immigrants, and which is actually a higher percentage of immigrants within the community than even the Latinx population. So that definitely is shaping our current labor history and current dynamics inside of our communities. And Asian American Pacific Islander workers are found in every occupation, every state in the country, but we're mostly concentrated in urban areas and industries like healthcare, government work, education, hospitality, the food industry, and in service sector jobs, especially within Asian ethnic communities. So I think that's I feel like a lot. There are a lot of ways we can go from there, but that's probably like the 50,000 foot overview of things where I definitely recognize that there are pieces that have been left out, but to even be able to tell you this history, I think is really something worth recognizing and celebrating, because it, like I mentioned, it took folks a long time to get even this short selection of dates recognized and thought of as our labor history.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've given us a great starting point, right? So people can go and they can look up everything in between, right? And get, an even more bigger idea of the AAPI community and the labor movement. So, my next question for you, what made you want to get involved with labor? Like, a lot about the labor movement, excuse me, the labor movement and the AAPI community. So, how did you, get started in all of this?
So my start, I think, with labor and unions goes back to I'm originally I originally grew up in Las Vegas. Like I would consider that my hometown, or the closest thing that I would have for a hometown. And Las Vegas is a very union dense city inside of a right to work state. So that's already an interesting dynamic there. But honestly, I think I first became aware of unions and the fact that workers could organize for to improve their working conditions when my mom's hospital started to form a union when I was in high school. And even then I didn't really I wasn't going to the union meetings with her or anything like that, but she would go off to those meetings, to the organizing meetings, and I'd hear bits and pieces of her talking with her coworkers about the campaign. So that was something that began to put the labor movement on my radar. And then I think the other piece that really made me aware that employers will wring workers out for all the work that they can do and not give back what workers are worth in return was I worked at a how do you call it, like a cafeteria service for like a major sports venue. So one of those one of those like food service contractors, where they had to hire like thousands of people really quickly and try to feed all the tens of thousands of people who are coming through this stadium. And it was really just like, it didn't matter how good of a worker you were or when you came on, like there was no loyalty from the employer to the worker. And so so issues like workers who weren't getting the correct pay on their paycheck, or who had to miss a shift because of family emergencies, like none of that was taken seriously from the employers. And if the worker didn't like it, I mean, they could just quit or be fired or go away. Like there was nothing compelling the employer to have any type of accountability to all these people who are making sure this giant like massive system of food service was operating every single day. Except these workers were all part of a union. Like they got a union card as part of their orientation, although it was not explained to them what this really was about. It was just like, here's a union card and you just sign it. So what I noticed is like, even though there was so much turnover, the people who came back to the employer with, hey, I'm a union member and you can't treat me like this, those were the folks who actually got to get their problems resolved or stay on for the rest of the season. And that kind of, that ticked in my brain, like, oh, so there's something to this being a union member that, gives you a voice when it seems like all the cards are stacked up against you. And then I actually ended up attending an AAPI convention, which was held in Las Vegas, almost, I want to say, maybe, oh gosh, I think it was 2009, so 11 years ago. Yeah, I don't know. No, that's over 11 years ago, 12 years, I think, which is pretty wild to me. And that's how I formally, like, really sat down and was like, okay, this is what the labor movement is. This is know how you can get a job in the labor movement. These are campaigns that working people have run to um, to win back wages, to win healthcare, to win a pay increase after so many years um, of low pay. And so that was really eye-opening, was coming back to Las Vegas and being part of that convention. And then from there, I got recruited into an organizer and training program. And then yeah, you could circle back to my introduction from that point.
Wow. So, being a member of Apollo, what has that been like for you? What has that experience been like? And just talk a little bit about the organization.
Sure. So for me, Apollo is my home inside of the labor movement. Like I mentioned, it was really my first formal entry into organized labor as we know it in the US. And kind of hitting back on what I mentioned within the history conversation, there is a history of Asian exclusion and anti-immigrant sentiment that is part of the labor movement's history. So Apollo was really a group where, we could talk about that and how are we, not settling for this being the status quo. How can we push the larger labor movement to be more inclusive of not just API workers, but immigrant workers, immigrant worker leaders? How do we push the labor movement to actually live up to its promise of representing all working people in the in the US, and as well as recognizing that workers in other countries are not our enemies. We have pushing that an agenda of global solidarity against exploitation that has been driven by imperialism, capitalism, colonialism. And so it was really great to have a community inside of the labor movement where we could recognize these contradictions, talk about it, and organize and mobilize to shape the labor movement that we wanted to see and be part of. And I think even today I mentioned that I'm a graduate student right now, not officially working in any type of union role, but I do have a union as a graduate student. I'm a member of the UAW 2865. So I have that tied to the labor movement, but also through Apollo, I'm able to still stay connected to union and organizing that's happening within the community where we are.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great to hear. And I'm glad that we definitely need more organizations like Apollo so that we can have these communities within the labor movement really, push us forward, right? Keep us moving forward. And so that kind of brings me to my next question because you mentioned it in the history part of the interview, and you just briefly kind of touched on a little bit about the labor movement, excluding certain groups, right? Having a history of that. So, how do we, include these groups into the labor movement? How can we be more inclusive of the AAPI community and other communities alike?
Definitely. And I think something that really resonated with me when I was working on the book for the Apollo 30th anniversary, I got to interview a lot of Apollo labor leaders who, like I said, have been active since 1992 and throughout the whole 30-year history of Apollo. And one of the interviews that really stuck with me was one that I did with Joanna Hester, who is in the AFSCME executive board and is also the assistant executive director for AFSCME Local 3930, United Domestic Workers, as well as an international vice president for AFSCME. In her interview, we talked about, how as an organizer, she helped to build a local union that really recognized the leadership of the workers that they were representing, which, as for domestic workers, that's largely going to be women, women of color, Black, Latinx, Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander. And so how do you, be mindful of these are the workers and their leaders should be coming from those communities as well. And so I think it is a matter of looking at the communities that need to be represented and recognizing their own leadership and recognizing that, if we want the labor movement to win, there's really no better people you could be putting in charge than women of color, immigrant women. People have really had to fight for every single opportunity, who had to go through incredible hardships just to get into the United States, and who have had to fight every single day on the job for respect, for dignity. These are women and leaders who had nothing handed to them. So they know how to fight, they know how to win. And it's just a matter, I think, of recognizing that and feeling, the being able to be like, yes, I see you as a leader and you're going to lead and I'm going to follow, versus, trying to shape and mold people, leaders from these types of communities into, what we typically think of already as labor movement leaders. So I think for the broader labor movement, it is about opening their imaginations to, things don't have to always be like how it was in the 1950s. I know that's when we had the largest share of the labor movement had like 30 something % of all American workers were in unions at that time. But I don't want the labor movement to look like how it did in the 1950s. So let's not do what we were doing then. Let's look at where we are in this present moment, and in these immigrant communities, these women of color led communities that have the expertise already. So it's just about, honestly, folks stepping back and letting them lead.
Right. So you mentioned the Apollo book. Is there any publication date for that or anything yet?
Yes, so the Apollo book will be available through the UCLA Labor Centers, I believe starting in July or August. It's coming out soon. It'll be coming out over the summer.
Okay.
So it's not out yet, but it'll be out in time for the Apollo biennial convention, which is happening in August, around August 5th to August 8th.
Oh, awesome. That's perfect timing. So, okay, thank you for joining me. I hope everybody, you can learn something from this. I definitely learned something from this, things that I did not know. And I'll definitely be on the lookout for that book. So you all should be on the lookout as well. So thank you, Emily, for joining me and for educating me and all the listeners on the AAPI community and the labor movement. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for all the work you're doing on this outlet.
Thank you so much for joining me for We the Union episode 9. I hope you enjoyed that great interview and learned a lot. I appreciate Emily for coming on and teaching us, because some of that stuff I did not know about. So I'm so happy that I was able to learn some new things, and hopefully we can all move towards a more inclusive labor movement, because that is what we are about, right? So thank you once again. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next time.